am Agnes McCann. I'm the chair of the Board of Library Trustees here at the Pratt Memorial Library, Cohasset. And on behalf of the trustees, I welcome you all. Thanks for coming. I also want to welcome or thank our sponsors, Dean and Hamilton Realtors, and Cook Estate, and Bruce Sinclair, the owner of A Taste for Wine and Spirits. I am honored and feel privileged to introduce our guest today, Andrew Bacevich, who will speak about his most recent book. The book is The Short American Century, a postmortem. It's a collection of essays he edited and published last year that reflect on what the last 70 years of American foreign policy has all been about and what it signifies for us today. Retired U.S. Army Colonel Bacevich is a professor of international relations at Boston University, a graduate of West Point who received his PhD in American diplomatic history from Princeton. He has written several books, the most recent being Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War. His op-ed pieces appear frequently in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, among many other major newspapers, and his essays can be found in several journals, including Foreign Affairs, The Nation, and the Wilson Quarterly. I don't think I need to tell you that he's really an eminent speaker. We are so looking forward to hearing what he has to say, and then afterwards, please stay with us for wine and cheese, and his books will be available for purchase and signing. It's a real honor for us to have him visit with us today, and we're grateful for his time. Please welcome him with me. And here he is.
So the first question is whether or not I need to put this on. I do, so it keeps on the back. No. How's it go? Like that. Like
Goes
this.
around the back
Like
of your
this.
neck, sir.
Like that, right?
Yeah.
So, all right, so, thank you very much for turning out on this kind of a lousy day. I'm very grateful to have a chance to talk to you for a while. This is a little bit of a challenging assignment in the sense that the court's too short. Challenging assignment in the sense that people don't normally give book talks about edited volumes. And I usually give a book talk about something you've written by yourself. And so for that reason, I think I probably need to provide just a little bit of context about what I thought we were trying to do in this project before telling you what we actually did in this project. Not infrequently in our country, when we hit a rough patch, the difficulties trigger something of a national conversation as to whether or not the country's reached a point where its best days are now behind it and the gloom and doom lies ahead. Usually the word that's used to frame this debate is decline. Some of us are old enough to remember that there was something of a declinist debate back in the 1950s. If you want to point to a very specific event that triggered the declinist debate in the 1950s, it would be the launch of Sputnik in 1957, which seemed to show that the Soviets were ahead of us in every aspect of science and technology, and some people wondered if we were ever going to catch up. Actually, we were ahead of them, and the whole debate was something of a fraud, but it was an issue of the day. There was another declinist debate, I think, that occurred in the latter part of the 1960s when it was evident that the Vietnam War had gone badly. We were contemplating the consequences of multiple assassinations. If you want to look at a specific point, it probably would be something like the 1968 and the Democratic National Convention. It really seemed that the country was coming apart, and people wondered if there would simply be a long decline from preeminence ahead. Something of the same thing occurred in the 1970s. Perhaps the declinist debate in the 1970s was sharpest after Watergate. Acute economic distress, oil shocks, evidence that the Soviets were flexing their muscles, the humiliation of the Iran hostage crisis, and the difficulty that the Carter administration had in managing all these problems. Again, many people said America's best days are behind it. And of course, in each of the three cases that I cited, either the perception of decline was false, or indeed the country recovered its balance and the declinist argument turned out to be a failure. Well, the premise of this exercise is one that posits that this time it really is different. At this time, we really have reached a turning point in our history and in the history of the world, and that what Henry Luce called, and we'll talk about Henry Luce, but what Henry Luce called the American century really has now finally ended. Well, what's the evidence of decline this time? And I think there are two important bits of evidence. One related to foreign policy, one related to domestic policy. With regard to foreign policy, it's the failure of the Iraq War, given the emphasis that the United States had placed on military power and on the exercise of military power, looking at the frustrations and failure that accompanied that war. That seems to me to be a very significant piece of evidence. And the second piece of evidence relating to domestic policy, of course, is the onset of the Great Recession, which we have been struggling with for some number of years now, with no obvious end and no restoration of real prosperity and growth anywhere in sight. Now, from a historian's perspective, to posit the end of the American century, in a sense, is suggestive of an opportunity. Because if this era of American preeminence has ended, then it becomes possible for us to ask, what was this era all about? Now that it's in our rear view window, what did it yield? What are we to make of it? And of course, from a policy analyst perspective, the end of the American century also poses questions, or perhaps poses challenges, because if the American century is over, then we're forced to consider what is it that comes next, what follows the American century, and how should the United States adjust to what is now going to be a fundamentally different era. So, in answering these questions, I took that phrase, the American century, and used it as kind of a point of departure, and more specifically, used the famous essay or editorial published under Henry Luce's byline as a kind of a hook. So let me talk a little bit first about that editorial, which appeared in Life magazine in the February 17th, 1941 issue. I would have bought the magazine. I have a copy of it, but I've leafed through it so many times it's fallen apart, and it would have been a big mess. But that essay is particularly interesting, I think, because it offers such a vivid representation of what the beginning of the American century meant and what it ought to mean, what Luce thought it would mean for the world as a whole. Remember where we are in February of 1941. I mean, the war in Europe is underway. It's been underway for a year and a half. But the United States, the American people, are deeply divided over whether or not the United States should be involved in that war. It's very much an unsettled issue in American politics at the time. The immediate purpose of Luce's essay was to try to use his muscle, or the muscle of Time Life, to influence that debate, because Luce himself was strongly in favor of intervening in the European war alongside the Brits against Nazi Germany. And although he said that in the essay, we need to intervene in the war, he said a lot more. And I think the first thing I'd like to do is to summarize very briefly what's the most important aspects of the content of his essay, The American Century. I'll try to signal when I'm giving quoted material, if I can remember to do this, by sort of raising my finger, and that's when you know I'm quoting Luce rather than just quoting myself from the book. To Luce, the moment had arrived for the United States to answer history's call. As he put it, the complete opportunity of leadership is ours. Americans simply needed to seize that opportunity, guiding others towards salvation. What we want will be okay with them. Yet Americans stubbornly and knowingly seemed intent on dodging their obligations, and here lay the taproot of the nation's current maladies. The cure was self-evident. Luce summoned his countrymen to accept wholeheartedly our duty and our opportunity to exert upon the world the full impact of our influence for such purposes as we see fit and by such means as we see fit. In an immediate sense, duty required the United States to ally itself with Great Britain as a full-fledged belligerent in the European war. Yet this amounted to hardly more than a necessary first step. Duty implied a mission of transforming the entire global order. In the course of performing that duty, Luce fully expected the United States to transform and perfect itself. Fortunately, perhaps even providentially, the world itself was changing in ways that appeared to accommodate America's requirement for a larger canvas upon which to work. Revolutionary changes were afoot, and for the first time in history, the prospect of one world, fundamentally indivisible, was presenting itself. No nation was better positioned to determine the character of this new world than the United States. As the inheritors of all the great principles of Western civilization, above all justice, the love of truth, the ideal of charity, Americans already embody what the indivisible global society might eventually become. American jazz, Hollywood movies, American slang, American machines and patented products, according to Luce, the only things that every community in the world, from Zanzibar to Hamburg, recognizes in common, already constituted the basis for an immense American internationalism. Yet this was only the beginning. Luce insisted that any American internationalism worthy of the name would necessarily incorporate the nation's distinctive ideas as well. It must be a sharing with all peoples of our Bill of Rights, our Declaration of Independence, and our Constitution. It must be an internationalism of the people, by the people, and for the people. By rising to this challenge, Luce hoped the United States might become the Good Samaritan of the entire world. So that's the vision, this incredibly ambitious argument that the United States needed to enter World War II, not simply to ensure the defeat of Nazi Germany and the survival of democracy, but indeed to bring out a radically new political and indeed moral order that would be modeled on the United States itself. Now, my specific contribution to this collection of essays was to write an introduction and a conclusion. And the purpose of the introduction was to describe the editorial. I just read to you part of that, but also to describe the package that the editorial came in. Luce's wondrous creation of a weekly picture magazine covering every aspect of human existence: war, politics, history, art, culture, science, sports, fads of all kinds, but with particular emphasis on promoting a middle-class, consumer-oriented vision of happiness. That is to say that although on the one hand, if you focused on this editorial, the American century was a challenge, something to which Americans had to arise. If you looked at all the pages on both sides of that editorial, what you saw was a display of in life of an American century that was both very tangible, very material, and very, very alluring. Let me give you a sense of that. So I describe many of the articles that are in this specific issue that had to do with new shows on Broadway, scientific discoveries, fads that the co-eds, as they were called then, on college campuses were addicted to. There was an article on fashion and so on. Then there were the advertisements, the basis of life's considerable profitability. Featured inside the front cover was a full-color ad for Libby's family of canned juices, which included Loganberry and Kraut. Raise your hand if you have ever had Kraut juice. I myself have not. And I'm guessing that it didn't last long in the family. Dad in coat and tie, a grandma in flower print dress, and sis, hair neatly braided, had gathered around the breakfast table to choose from among Libby's 10 different varieties. Gadgets promised improvements in everyday life. Electric irons, electric coffee makers, automatic clothes washers, easy as turning on a light, and electric sun lamps. You too can have that winter vacation look. Packaged foods offered both convenience and nutrition. Frozen succotash, processed meats, cellophane-wrapped donuts, dated for freshness, canned chicken noodle soup, a favorite among the simple, homey dishes that built the men who built the nation, and dromedary brand gingerbread mix made from the original recipe of George Washington's mother, I'm not making it up, promoting the down-home goodness of cream of wheat and Aunt Jemima pancakes were grinning images of African Americans otherwise absent from the advertisements appearing in life. For men, there were several brands of whiskey. For women, slips, girdles, bras, hosiery, face powder, and diamonds. For everyone, mouthwash and tobacco, with Lucky Strike declaring it was paying top dollar for the finer, lighter, the more naturally mild tobaccos. Testifying most alluringly to the promise of American life were the car ads, each one a full page, most in vivid color. A Chrysler in cerulean blue with plaid interior, featuring a Spitfire engine and Vacuumatic transmission. A dashing red Mercury Roadster built according to aviation principles. An Oldsmobile Special Town sedan available in gleaming yellow, and a Chevrolet with its Victory engine, Unisteel turret top, and Tiptomatic clutch, all offered at no extra cost. With more than 10 million female drivers cruising American highways and byways, a Ford ad announced that it is the women of this country who determine what needs the engineers must meet. And it depicted a sturdy green four-door as the tangible response to these needs. Here was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness made manifest. So that was the introduction, and then the object of the exercise, this actually began as a lecture series. I recruited 8 very distinguished scholars, 7 of them historians, 1 a political scientist, to basically come to Boston University and give their best shot at explaining, well, if the American century is indeed over, if this is where we began, this vision of Luce, if we've ended up with the frustrations of Iraq and the disappointments of the Great Recession, then what indeed was this American century all about? What are we to make of it? And I'm not going to try to summarize their findings, because we'd be here so long that the cheese would go bad. But let me simply say that I intentionally recruited people who were going to respect a wide variety of viewpoints. That's what we got. And most of them basically reached the conclusion that what we got in the American century was quite a bit different than both what Luce expected and what American leaders had intended all along. I'll give you one example. A wonderful historian from UC Irvine, Emily Rosenberg, basically argued that the essence of the American century was to export our consumer culture around the world. That what we sought for the couple 100 million people living in our country, now over 300 million, basically the rest of the world, the other 6 billion, decided they want to have some of the same. This is how she concludes her essay. Whereas the institutions and desire-making technologies of mass consumerism had once stimulated America's productive capacities and helped solidify its national cohesion and its middle class, the increasingly globalized system of mass production, mass consumerism, and credit innovations began to prey on America's consumer citizens. The central logic of post-war mass production became driving down prices by driving down costs of production. And Americans, as the world's most reliable consumers, became buyers of last resort in a global economy that inexorably spread productive capacity to ever less expensive areas. As advertisers stoked demand, financial institutions, enabled by deregulation, sought higher profits in ever more elaborate schemes to expand credit, papering over the gap between what Americans produced and what they purchased. Especially after the turn of the 21st century, the glut of savings that piled up in export-rich countries helped further drive down costs for credit and loosen standards. Moreover, a consumerist system in which abundance had once seemed a central problem increasingly strained an environment beset by consumer change and natural resource. American century became its undoing. So that's an example of the kind of thing that my essayists tried to do in answering their question. So after running through all that, then I sort of added my short postscript, which intended to bring things up to date and to call for, and also I think intended to say, well, if indeed that's true, then where does that leave us, and what does it mean for how we should go ahead? So I'll give our little Jeremiah at the end, and I'll just read a brief excerpt from that. To further indulge old illusions, I don't have to hold my hand up because this is all me now. To further indulge old illusions of the United States presiding over and directing the course of history will not only impede the ability of Americans to understand the world and themselves, but may well pose a positive danger to both. Faced with a reality that includes within the last decade alone an inability to anticipate, citing the events of 9/11 as an example, an inability to control, citing the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as examples, an inability to afford, manifested by a badly overstretched military, trillion-dollar annual deficits, and increasingly unaffordable entitlement programs, an inability to respond, demonstrated by a dysfunctional political system. And finally, an inability to comprehend what God intends or the human heart desires. Given all these, I conclude that Americans today would do well to temper any claims or expectations of completing the world's redemption. So, that's what the Short American Century is all about, and I hope some of you will take a look at it. I tell you what, if you don't want this, I have a 2005 book called The New American Militarism that's coming out in a new edition next month. And I got a new book coming out in the fall called Breach of Trust. Now, should you choose to buy all three of them, that is completely okay. My point is simply that if this is not your cup of tea, there'll be other opportunities. And I'm very grateful for your patience in listening to me, and I look forward to any comments or questions that you may have. Yes, ma'am.
Since you labeled Vietnam as one of the earlier points, and then Iraq as a signature point to a decline, how do you see those so different? I mean, certainly the feelings coming out of Vietnam were far worse in terms of failure than coming out of Iraq in the lay people's mind, I think, and the shame as demonstrated by how we behaved. But you point to one as the signature piece for the end of the American century, as the other was just part of the process.
Well, that's a good question. I can make a larger argument. I think I have somewhere along the line made the larger argument that the true pivot was the 1960s in Vietnam. I know I've made this argument. That to my mind, the failure in Vietnam and all that was related to it actually began a process of U.S. decline. But it was not evident then. And I think in particular it was not evident then because the Soviet decline happened at a faster rate than our own. And led to this illusion that was very widespread in the 1990s, that we had won the Cold War, and that having won the Cold War, we now enjoyed the status of, as the phrase everybody used, the world's sole superpower. And we especially imagined that the foundation of being the world's sole superpower was our possession of superior military power. What we have found in Iraq is that we have a wonderful military that we found there in Afghanistan. We have a wonderful military that can't win. And therefore, its utility in trying to sustain the proposition that we're the sole superpower is limited. Is that a fair answer?
Well, but you used one as a endpoint of this American century, the other one was just part of it, so I'm still wondering, how do you differentiate? One would be a hallmark of the
Well,
end.
I mean,
You're actually saying now Vietnam was part of the end.
We must be honest. Who knows if the American century has ended with the Iraq War and the
Right.
Great Recession? You know, you could see me 5 years from now and say, "Hey, Bucko, the stock market just passed 25,000 and unemployment's at 4.2%, and the Chinese have collapsed. What do you think?" And I would say, "Well, I guess I got it wrong." I mean, truly, only time will tell whether or not we can point to these proximate events as suggesting that a real turning point has occurred. I've put down a very small bet in putting together this book. But with regard to Vietnam, I think is that the country seemingly came back. I mean, if you're a conservative Republican and you say, "Yeah, we came back because Ronald Reagan became president and saved the day. We got rid of Jimmy Carter, and with new leadership and confidence and tax cuts, everything came out okay." I think it's a very shallow reading, but that may be a shallow reading, but it is true that the country was able to recover from the problems of the 60s in ways that I'm speculating we may not be able to do from our current problems. Yes, ma'am.
So are you measuring the end of the century as when we are not the world leader and China is? Is that sort of the definition?
Well, I don't think it's, to my mind, and this is where, in a sense, I don't really like the term decline, even though that's the term that it becomes the center of the debate. I think it's not so much that we're declining than others are rising. And China would seem to be, at the present moment, again, who knows what troubles they're going to have, would seem to be an example of a country that is rising while we struggle with our problems. But that said, I think it's much more likely that the 21st century is unlikely to give us an international order in which the Chinese are the sole superpower. I think it's much more likely that we'll have an international order in which there are some number of powers that have to be taken into account. Not all of them will be equal. Not all of them will manifest their influence in the same ways. It's hard to think of Europe, for example, being militarily significant, but it's easy to imagine Europe being economically significant in this coming order. So to me, the key thing is to begin to entertain the likelihood that this will be a multipolar order in which we will be a very, very strong player. No question about that. But the conceits of the 1990s, the post-Cold War conceits of a unipolar order, of the United States exercising global hegemony, I think those conceits have already been disproven, and the faster we sort of let them go, the better for us. Yes.
Yes, the way you started your presentation within the context of World War II, it did make sense to really focus on the military, and you represent a military background. Actually, my father was military. That makes sense to me, but to me it seems that the mindset we have to keep in mind are different types of powers. So, true, the United States is known as a dominant military force worldwide. People turn to us as the policemen of the world, but what you seem to be hinting at as you summarize is we have to think of other types of power. And so the United States may dominate either in its influence on economics, or which it already does, or also the whole question of in what I'm talking about isn't just, of course, we're the strongest economic power right now, although we're in so much debt, but I'm also talking about the almost the philosophy that influences the way that we interact with the rest of the world. We influence education systems all over the world. I've worked with the Peace Corps for years. I mean, there are influences from the United States that really go beyond military to economic to actually almost the world view that others have.
I just don't think that in any of those arenas that I would want to characterize our role as dominant.
No, I agree with that.
Yes, sir.
Yes, talking about economics, it got me thinking about most of the economic powerhouses in the world are mid-latitude, say between 30 and 50 north or south. Australia, New Zealand as examples, some of the far south American countries. The biggest population growths appear to be in the tropical areas.
I can tell you're going to ask a question where I'm going to say, geez, I don't know, I never thought of that. Go ahead.
I'm wondering where economy depends on labor, economics depends on labor to make things that people can buy and sell. Have you thought about that in terms of where is this huge underused population going to fit in the coming century where our power will be diminished somewhat and there'll be a sharing of power and influence throughout the world, as you just mentioned? How do you see those people fitting in it, or do you?
Seriously, I'm not sure I understood the question. But you're saying that are you saying that the rapid population growth is greatest in places that have tended not to be economically productive?
Exactly.
And you're positing that the reason they haven't been economically productive is because they don't live within certain bands of latitude.
Yeah.
I don't know, I never thought of that question. Actually, I would be very suspicious of that, only in this sense that, and I'm not an economist, but there's something magical that seems to happen sometimes, that a country that's more or less written off as economically backward, over the course of 2 or 3 decades, suddenly becomes an economic powerhouse.
Brazil.
And it's not clear to me that the climate is necessarily a determinant of why and when that happens. You just said Brazil, but you could point to Taiwan, you could point to South Korea, you could point to now the People's Republic of China. Apparently, I've never visited India, but apparently in many parts of India there's this tremendous economic dynamism in a society that 30, 50 years ago people would have said, oh man, mired in dysfunction. I don't know why that happens. I would just be a little bit skeptical about having the explanation be tied to what latitude the country falls in, but I honestly don't know.
Well, Korea and China and even Taiwan are still mid-latitude countries. You know, they're not tropical. India, a good deal of India is. I mean, Brazil is the glaring example of incredible growth and success in manufacturing.
How's Chile fit in your argument?
Chile is still pretty agrarian. You know, they basically they grow fruit, grapes, and wine. But they have a European.
I'm not sure that's
population.
true, actually.
They have a little shipbuilding, but not too.
Okay, well, you know more than I do about that. Yes, sir.
Do you think that the percentage of the population that believes in American exceptionalism is going to be a huge barrier to our ability to work in this new world? because it causes us to ignore the attitudes and beliefs and differences that exist. And how do we go about trying to get more realism?
Oh, shoot. I was going to give you a one-word answer and say yes. And then you say, well, what do we do about it? Because I do think it's a problem, and it's a problem, of course, that the political classes reinforce. And so much of the political rhetoric, at least springs from this notion of our specialness, our uniqueness, and our chosenness. Remember the big hoop-de-doo, must be 2 years ago now, when somebody at a press conference asked the president, do you believe in American exceptionalism? And the president said, of course I believe in American exceptionalism. I believe in American exceptionalism just like the Brits believe in British exceptionalism, and the Danes believe in Danish. And he got hammered, okay? Because American exceptionalism doesn't mean a unique identity. American exceptionalism means, in the eyes of its proponents, this sense of chosenness, this special mission endowed upon us by God, by providence. Certainly, Henry Luce believed in that version of American exceptionalism. And so it's somehow, I don't know if it's in maybe the people who mix the fluoride in the water, that they all mix in some kind of an ingredient that we all end up growing up believing in American exceptionalism. But I think it's a problem, because it prevents you from seeing yourself the way you are, it prevents you from seeing the world the way it is, prevents you from understanding your history, prevents you from understanding why you're perceived the way you happen to be perceived. So it introduces this absence of reality that I think is troubling. Now, shouldn't we be proud to be Americans? Yes, of course we should be. Shouldn't we love our country? Yes, we should love our country. And yet, there is an extent to which that notion gets carried that I think is absolutely counterproductive, and I'm sorry, I have no idea how to deal with it. I teach this course at Boston University called Ideas in American Foreign Policy, which tries to evaluate the way ideas have affected the making of policy and the way ideas informed the critical views of policy. And the first document we begin with, because I think it is of such incredible importance, is John Winthrop's sermon on the deck of the Arabella, 1630, claiming that in founding this place that is about to be called the Massachusetts Bay Colony, that community is forming a covenant with God. God has chosen those people for a special mission, and the mission is not just go carve a colony out of the wilderness. The purpose is to serve as a city upon a hill, to illuminate the world and change the world. This is like, 68 people sitting on the rocking deck of a little tiny ship, and they were absolutely persuaded that their purpose was to change the world. And that notion carries on. The sort of the very, the salience of that phrase, city upon a hill, the way it lives on as part of our politics, is indicative, I think, of the way this idea of American exceptionalism is so deeply ingrained. And it's a problem. Yes, ma'am.
This has to do with going for the military solution, which you write about. There's a lot of discussion about gun control right now, but what about the international marketing, sale, and traffic of arms, and what kind of oversight?
That's where dominance is the appropriate term. We dominate that market. We sell, in terms of dollar amounts, it's something like 80% of weapons sold exports last year globally were by the United States. The market used to be kind of shared between the United States and the Soviet Union, but it's ours now. It's unbelievable.
And what kind of oversight is there?
I don't know of any particular. Well, no, there are some agreements, for example, on the export of small arms. I don't, and of course we don't. In particular, that's not our strong suit. No.
I guess
The
not.
commies can make AK-47s a lot more cheaply than we can make M4s. So if you're in the market for small arms, you tend not to go for American weapons. Our strong suit tends to be the upper end high-tech weapons, and I don't really know, but I don't know of any particular restrictions on that. To the extent that we cut a deal with a country, we can sell them what we want, and they can buy whatever they can afford. Now, Congress, of course, places limits and sanctions on what can be done in relation with, I mean, if President Obama got up tomorrow morning and said, I got a great idea, Fidel and Raul need some F-15s, he would not be able to sell F-15s to Cuba. But apart from those countries that are kind of placed off limits, I think that the United States government can sell whatever it wants to whomever it wants to. By the way, nukes would be an exception here, of course. Under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, if nuclear weapon states cannot sell nuclear weapons or give nuclear weapons to non-nuclear states.
Well, how do our weapons get in the hands of, like, the Taliban?
Well, in that specific case, and I don't know how many of our weapons got to the Taliban. I mean, the average Taliban is a guy who's carrying an AK-47, not carrying an American assault rifle. But during the 1980s, during the time of the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, we poured billions and billions of dollars of military support, mostly funneled through Pakistan, which was ripping off a considerable part of it, funneling that support to the Mujahideen, to the freedom fighters who were resisting, the Afghan freedom fighters who were resisting the Soviet occupation. And you will remember that when the Soviets finally withdrew in what, 1989, 1990, that was proclaimed to be a great victory of freedom over communism. Turned out that the freedom fighters didn't exactly believe in freedom as we define freedom because they became the Taliban. Some portion of them became the Taliban. And so there are some amount of American weapons that are floating around that part of the world as a consequence. Yes, sir.
My question has to do with the absolute level of military spending, which I personally believe, I've come to believe, that is not only too high, but wildly too high. I mean, wildly too high. My question is this. Very recently, we finally started to see some people in the middle, and even some people on the right, start to publicly question start to express some skepticism about the level of military spending. And I'm just wondering, in your opinion, whether you think that slight trend of skepticism toward military spending has legs, or whether the sort of autopilot nature of what we spend is just too far gone, the vested interests are too great, such that, I mean, which direction do you think we go from here?
Well, I think there's going to be some modest cuts, and there's going to be a modest reduction in the overall size of the military, particularly the Army is going to take a hit. The Marine Corps is taking a small hit, I think is the plan. And there will be those who will then howl that we are weakening ourselves and placing the country's safety in danger. I think that's a bunch of nonsense. I guess I would not see it as significant. I would turn it around and say, it seems to me that there continues to be a pretty strong consensus that we have to remain far and away the strongest military power in the world. You're not going to get elected to any national office unless you subscribe to that notion. And therefore the debate ends up being, should the budget be, what is it now, about $750 billion a year if you count war spending? Should we be spending $700 billion a year or $750? Let's have a debate. But in either case, the number is so much larger than the defense budget of any other country, any other combination of countries, that it's the consensus, it seems to me, that deserves our attention, not the marginal disagreement. And part of the problem here, I think, is that the American people are not seriously engaged in evaluating what we're getting for our money. I mean, we've been in war now for more than a decade. How's it going? How many victories we've been able to chalk up? What has the cost been? Cost measured in many different ways. American people are not particularly engaged in, they're not willing to sort of think critically about the outcomes and consequences of using force. And they're not particularly engaged in that argument because, number one, the vast majority of Americans don't have any stake because they're not serving, their kids are not serving, their grandchildren are not serving. Obviously some people are. but the country as a whole has now detached itself from the American military, and we're not even paying for it in terms of dollars, right? I mean, when it's unbelievable. You know, when you think about it. In the book that's going to come out in the fall, I mean, I quote Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt's getting ready to gear us up for World War II, and he says, look, if we go to war, that means sacrifice. That means we're all going to sacrifice. Taxes are going to go up. Right, okay. Now, we didn't pay for World War II as an ongoing proposition, not by any means, because the costs were very, very, very high. But nonetheless, there was some sense that the country was engaged in the conflict. That's not the case in the past decade. You know, we got tax cuts, right? I mean, $1 trillion deficits now for, what is it, the fifth or the sixth year? Fifth year, right? And there's a certain amount of hue and cry that says, well, that's a bad thing, we need to get that under control. But not to the point yet, at least, that people say, well, if $1 trillion deficits are unacceptable, and if to some degree, not entirely, if to some degree military spending is a significant contribution, then maybe we ought to think differently about what we expect our military to do, and therefore we might be able to think differently about what it would look like, and therefore we might be able to think differently about what it would cost. And that's, I mean, people say these things all the time, but it's not gotten to the point where that really becomes a serious debate in Washington, it seems to me.
So you seem to be saying until economics forces you to change, it won't change.
Well, that's my view, yeah. And of course, by then it'll probably be too late. But I mean, I'm very pessimistic on these matters. But I mean, and again, I'm not an economist, but I mean, there are those who say that once the ratio between debt and the size of the economy gets to a certain point, it becomes exceedingly difficult to have robust rates of growth. And therefore, if we continue down the path we're going on, and it seems to me that there's little evidence that Washington has a way to not to reverse course, that we will find ourselves, arguably, in a predicament where we will condemn the next generation to a long period of basically very negligible growth in terms of the size of the economy. You know, perpetual high unemployment, perpetual low growth, and you know, that's not a happy future for our children and our grandchildren. Yes, sir.
I think
You got some good news for us?
pretty good.
Get our good.
Well,
Here's the good news.
Well, I don't think, well, it depends on whom you are, where you work, and how you earn your living. I think part of the problem we have with the military spending is that it is sold, pretty much the way Luce was selling things, as national defense. And it's only partly national defense. A great deal of military spending is to provide jobs for people.
Right.
Every congressional district in
Right.
the United States
Right.
has a congressman who will go to the mattresses.
Right. I
to
mean,
keep
isn't
making-
Raytheon the #1 employer in
Sure.
the Commonwealth?
Yeah,
Right.
so it's hard to have a conversation
Right.
about defending our republic when off to the side is that shadow, that lurking shadow of unemployment in
Right.
building Abrams tanks or something.
Right.
It's not good news.
I was going to say, what's the good news?
I don't-
You're just adding one more argument as to why this is a very, very difficult thing to do, given who exercises power and sort of the. Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna, it just occurred to me out of the blue that when I was a younger man, the airplane that I flew had "Peace is our profession" on the side of it. Peace is our profession.
You were in SAC?
Yes, I was.
Oh.
That blew, boo, yeah. But where I was going with this is, whether it was really our profession or not, I don't know, but a lot of guys working in Boeing building those airplanes had good jobs, so.
Sure.
There was in other words, there was a relationship between
Right.
the military, the peace of being our profession, and the guys building those airplanes.
Who's that? Where are you flying? B-52s?
Yes.
Ah, okay. Sir.
Getting away from the military for a second, what about the economic engine as a whole? In other words, if the United States has been exceptional in its ability to innovate, create, patent new things, you know, best software in the world, best systems in the world, all of those kinds of things, is that part of the book, and is there some understanding, in other words, if American exceptionalism includes that dynamism?
Yeah, there's an essay two essays really, one by David Kennedy, but with the other one more specifically looking at economics by Jeffrey Frieden, that argue that, and these are probably the two essays that take the most favorable view of what the American century was all about. Both of them say, yeah, it's over, but they have a favorable view. And the favorable view is one that says that coming out of World War II, the United States, this isn't so much on the issue of technology, but that the United States, from a position of preeminence after 1945, helped to put in place an international economic order that for a period of time was conducive to both growth and stability. Now, they both argue that that deteriorated over time, but they both point to that as a major achievement that helped to bring about the decades of post-war prosperity that I enjoyed when I was a kid growing up. But they say that that was then, it ain't now. Yes, sir.
Yeah, return to the concept of American exceptionalism. I ask you to speculate what Luce would have, when he wrote that essay, projected things would be like at the transition from the end of the American century when it happened, and what would follow. In other words, if the project...
I think he would have said, what do you mean, end of the American century?
Well, I'm not positive. The project is successful. We've propagated all these values to the rest of the world. They've rooted the rest of the world as living that way, or a good chunk of it. Does that mean that this particular country that started it is still naturally the preeminent leader, and can that even be? Can you truly propagate those values and have the rest of the world take them on, and yet have one country remain the
Well, remember the
dominant
values that he says he wants to propagate, the values his magazine is propagating are consumer values for the most part, or values related to some fairly superficial things related to entertainment and the like, right? But the values that he says he's propagating in the essay are of a different order. That the American century is about propagating our ideals, our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, citing the Gettysburg Address, and remember, he's the son of Christian missionaries. Spent the first part of his life in China, okay? And it's about propagating the values of Christianity, where we will become, he says, the Good Samaritan of the world. And in that sense, I don't know if he cared specifically about the peoples of the world individually subscribing to Christianity, but that would be the basis for a harmonious order. I don't know that he would have been capable of imagining what would follow. I mean, that was his utopia. This world that looks like us, or at least like we think we are.
You know the answer. And by the way, we've never met, so this is a... I have a more interesting question. As a graduate and a parent of West Point, what's the efficacy going forward of our military academies? I'm a little curious about where they fit in the new thinking and going forward.
Well, I don't know if I mentioned, maybe I did, but maybe I didn't. I have a new edition of a book called The New American Militism. It's coming out next month, actually. And in my conclusion to that book, I think my argument is that it's time to convert the service academies from four-year undergraduate institutions into one-year institution with a one-year program that basically socializes people to become military officers. And basically the argument is not that I have anything against West Point or the Naval Academy. It's that I believe that as a small step towards closing the gap between the military and society, we should want every member of the officer corps to receive his education in an undergraduate institution alongside his or her fellow citizens.
So you're arguing for the ROTC?
Rooted, pardon?
You're arguing for ROTC programs?
Kind of, although I would modify the way ROTC works right now. But basically, yes. That officers come out of liberal
Civilian.
institutions and then undergo a professionalization at a place at West Point or at Annapolis or at Colorado Springs. But the problem here, of course, is if you do that, no Army-Navy game. Although, as a military academy graduate, now that we've lost 11 years in a row, it could actually be a benefit. You wouldn't have to suffer through that annual humiliation.
Share, and why shouldn't they have it?
I had noticed that, except for the
Well,
people down in Texas that want to
Well,
secede because
and we all say,
President
"Go
Obama
ahead,
was
please."
reelected.
I don't know, it was just a feeling I have that there's very little to unify us and we.
Well, I don't know that I don't know if it's sectionalism, but I mean, there are powerful forces afoot that are antagonistic to community and that emphasize sort of a me-first individualism. One probably shouldn't overstate those, but it is part of life. I mean, it's a great privilege to teach at a place like Boston University, and the young people are very sweet and wonderful. But I walk up and down Commonwealth Avenue between classes, and it's astonishing because what I see is this. People retreat into this world of the internet, and they treat their smartphones as if they're sacred objects to which they have to constantly attend. And as a consequence of that, their focus is down and in rather than out, even though they're walking past, all of their classmates. And I mean, I shouldn't put my finger. I mean, I don't have a smartphone, but I mean, my wife will tell you the first thing I do is get up in the morning and go down and make my coffee and put my laptop on the table and start
But
doing
you're
emails.
you're trying to see what's going on in the world too, right?
Yeah, but it's a less sort of insidious form of that disease. But then she comes down and I put this out. But I think it's not the role that founders of the UN hope for. I mean, the role they hope for, but this would be the organization that would prevent war. That was the big hope, that we were going to get through World War II, and then we were going to create something better than the League of Nations, and this would be the forum within which differences would be solved. Well, that didn't work out, and it's not going to work out. But I think it would go way too far to say we should abolish the United Nations, because my sense is that the United Nations actually does very good work in realms not related to war.
Well,
That they are the promoter and sponsor of programs related to poverty, social well-being, health, culture, that are useful. They're not transformative. They're not fixing everything that's broken. But that if the UN went away, that we would find the loss was an important one. And I think that means that I'm getting the hook.
Not so subtle.
So we should reduce our ambitions, be more modest. It doesn't mean disarm. Doesn't mean I think that everybody's going to love us. But I think the purpose of the American military should be to defend the country. And that's pretty close to putting a period on it.
Please stay, enjoy some wine and cheese, and there are books for sale, and Professor Bacevich has been kind enough to agree to sign the book if you like.